the bitter end. So this is actually quite a long paper with a rather long and not terribly exciting title, but it picks up on a number of themes that were introduced in the morning session, both by the chairman of BPI, or the managing director of BPI, but also Paul Collier in his presentation on public investment. So, what I want to do, if I could, one of these things is going to... Okay, so the outline of the paper, I want to just pick up on an old problem in public finance and public investment. And I'm actually going to present some results from a model that is calibrated to data for sub-Saharan Africa, but it's not an estimated model. If you want to fix some idea in your head, it's calibrated roughly to a kind of East African representative small open economy. It's a kind of blend of Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And I'm going to just talk through a few of the implications, the public finance implications that accompany a decision to increase the rate of public investment in such a country in the context of distortionary taxes. There are a number of extensions that I won't have time to talk about today, but I'll highlight and maybe discuss something. So the starting point is essentially what Paul Collier talked about, this idea that there's an infrastructure gap in sub-Saharan Africa, the idea that in some sense the stock of public capital is inefficiently low. And there are a variety of estimates of the size of this infrastructure gap. The Commission for Africa, this Blair Commission from 2005, around about the time of the Glen Eagles Commission, estimated that the infrastructure gap at $40 billion. More recently, I think that was the number that Paul used this morning, more recently it's called the Africa Infrastructure Country Diagnostic, AICD, presumably because they didn't want to call it the Africa Country Infrastructure Diagnostic for obvious reasons. They estimated infrastructure gap closer to $100 billion for sub-Saharan Africa. This is based on essentially power, roads, ports and airport infrastructure, so it's a very particular sort of physical infrastructure. And associated with that, there's lots of statements about the appropriate blend of financing. Is it domestic financing, tax financing, external concessional debt, IBRD, non-concessional debt such as sovereign bonds. There's a lot of discussion and a lot of enthusiasm from all quarters on the idea that there's an infrastructure gap, and now is the time to think about filling it. This is a version of the same table that came up this morning, looking at some of the recent Eurobond issues, sovereign Eurobond issues from sub-Saharan African economies. I won't dwell on it because it has been talked about a lot this morning, except to note that the quantities, the volumes of finance raised are quite high. This is sort of 10 to 12 billion, with a few other items left off this table, 10 to 12 billion dollars over the last 5 or 6 years, which is large by historical standards for sub-Saharan Africa, at yields at issue and even relatively contemporary yields, this is December 2013, that are pretty competitive by historical standards and indeed compared to IBRD financing, with some really very low yields at issue. The one that everybody was talking about is Zambia 10-year bond, $750 million at 5.6%, 15 times oversubscribed. So a fairly substantial appetite for the supply of funds, and this is fueled in large measure by this is from the World Economic Outlook, or the Regional Economic Outlook from the IMF. This is median and distribution around the median debt. Profile for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, showing a very substantial reduction from around about 100% down to something in the region of 40%. So we have an enthusiasm from the supply side and a perception from the demand side, from African governments in particular, that there's plenty of debt headroom, so to speak, that the current debt stocks, especially post-debt relief initiatives in the late 90s and first decade of this century, have left a lot of countries with a fair amount of space. So the red bars are their external debt to GDP ratios, the green bars are domestic debt, the total is their total public indebtedness, and these X's and dots are two different ways in which the IMF World Bank debt sustainability teams assess thresholds above which debt is deemed to be unsustainably high. So the key thing is the gap for a number of these countries between even the lowest threshold and current debt levels. So this has helped to support the notion that the infrastructure gap is large. There's an urgent need to respond to fill that gap. There's a lot of discussion about the high rates of return on the margin to investment in Africa, and that there are resources mobilized on the supply side and a degree of debt headroom to make this possible. I want to just rain on the parade a little bit and try and bring out three important interrelations that really shape the way in which we should be thinking about public investment and debt sustainability. And these are as follows. The first is that recurrent costs, the operating costs of public capital, are typically much larger than anticipated and much larger than assumed in many debt sustainability calculations. O&M, operations and maintenance expenditures, are also, as we know, extremely vulnerable in times of fiscal crisis. They are the first sources of finance to be, first sources of expenditure to be pared back in times of crisis. And this is not without cost, although the cost may be intertemporal. So deficient operations and maintenance expenditures undermine the return to capital. So ex ante, the return to public capital in these environments may be very large, but ex post, these can be reduced very substantially by deficient operations and maintenance. This is all sort of pretty obvious common sense. The second point is that the returns from public investment, as we know, are often difficult to appropriate through user fees or levies. And this may be for technical reasons or it may be for political economy reasons. It's just difficult to put in place the infrastructure and the mechanisms required to appropriate the returns to the state from public investment. If you recall the example that Paul Collier gave in the morning, he was focusing on the power sector. The power sector being one where appropriability is probably higher than elsewhere. The key point about high recurrent costs and low appropriability is the extent to which it shifts the burden onto the domestic tax system. Tax systems which in sub-Saharan Africa, as I'll show, tend to embody quite high distortions of the margin, high growth-reducing distortions. So you'd think these are three basic characteristics that should appear in any debt sustainability analysis, any general equilibrium framework for thinking about the consequences of undertaking a public investment surge. But the ironic thing is, if you look at even the new debt sustainability analysis framework in the World Bank current budgetary costs that must be financed in addition to the initial capital cost and the ongoing cost of debt servicing. Failure to do so, which may occur because of a failure of coordination between different parts of government or the political economy of the fact that there are no current votes in tomorrow's capital stock, so to speak, is this universal reality that O&M costs across sub-Saharan Africa are typically inadequate. We're very familiar with capital stock that is poorly maintained, depreciates quickly, and doesn't yield the flow of public services that complement private factors of production. The scale of these recurrent costs is really quite astounding. And this is a table that comes from somebody called Peter Heller, who used to be the Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. And he's estimating the cents per dollar. This is the flow per annum per dollar of installed capital stock, all appropriately valued, for different types of infrastructure. There's an important distinction here. We've got the kind of physical infrastructure, say like feeder roads or paved roads, which are kind of 3 to 10 cents per dollar of capital installed. So large amounts of capital installed, but relatively small operations and maintenance costs, as opposed to what might be called MDG type of capital, public capital in health and education, where the initial capital outlay may be relatively low, but the recurrent costs can be extremely high. This is the teachers and nurses that we're talking about. These are all expressed in terms of public capital, but if you think that, roughly speaking, as a rule of thumb, the capital to output ratio might be in the order of between 2 and 5, you can scale these back to GDP. And doing so even on the most optimistic basis, you see that these are large amounts of recurrent costs that we're talking about to maintain the capital stock in a productive fashion. This wouldn't be too much of a problem if we could appropriate these costs from the returns to the public investment, but governments typically find that rather difficult. Which, as I said, casts back onto the public purse. And this is the final piece of information that kind of ties these 3 points together, and that is, what do we know about the degree of distortion in tax systems? So typically, obviously, raising $1 of government revenue imposes more than $1 of costs in the private sector. So that's what we were interested in measuring, this marginal cost of funds term. There's a very nice recent paper in the JDE that computes marginal cost of funds both for systems as a whole and across different types of tax. And we see that, roughly speaking, $1 of public expenditure costs the private sector about $1.20 across the tax system as a whole. In sub-Saharan Africa, the range is very large between consumption taxes, which are relatively non-distortionary on average, and much higher for factor taxes, taxes on profits, taxes on labour income. Okay, let's just spend 2 minutes on a little bit of arithmetic, since we haven't had any today, and then I'll have a look at the model in my final 10 minutes. So the very simple starting point is, you want to invest in a project. Well, the benchmark, presumably, if the project is fully appropriable, you can grab the returns from the project. You're going to undertake the project if the benefit-cost ratio is greater than 1. And where the costs here that you're appropriating are the full set of recurrent operations and maintenance costs, financing costs on the financing mechanism, it's debt costs, and depreciation. If you only recover a fraction of that because of limited appropriability, so you only recover a fraction F of that, of the return to the public investment, the rest accrues to the private sector, you need to tax back that private sector. And existing taxes recover a certain amount, let's call it TAR, but as I said before, with some distortion. So this changes the calculations. So there are 2 calculations to bear in mind. One is the fiscal calculation. How big does the return have to be, the benefit from the project have to be to leave the budget neutral? And the second is not a fiscal issue, it's a welfare issue. Given the distortions in the system and how much tax has to be increased to grab back the returns to service the financing of this investment, how big does the benefit-cost ratio have to be for it to be generating a social return, benefit-cost ratio that covers the distortionary effect of the tax? And here's a little table, which is my last point before I move on to the model that we operate. So this is just a useful, simple partial equilibrium calculation for a tax ratio that's about the sub-Saharan African average and a marginal cost of funds which is about the sub-Saharan African average. So for projects that are obviously, if they're fully appropriable, the minimum benefit cost ratio will be 1. But if you reduce the degree of appropriability, essentially as you go from Paul Collier's power project to, I don't know, roads or health and education investments where it's difficult to appropriate the return fully, the threshold for fiscal neutrality rises very sharply, as does the threshold for the welfare case. So with low appropriability, let's just take the sort of 25% appropriability, you need projects to be returning at 2.5 times as much to avoid imposing significant budgetary pressures, and about 20% more to generate or to justify investment in purely welfare basis. So this is the problem. You've got these three interrelated issues: high recurrent costs, limited appropriability, and a distortionary tax system, which I tried to convince you could be rather important. What happens when you throw this into a standard debt sustainability framework? What are the implications? So what we do here is we take what might be called the new IMF standard model that underpins their debt sustainability framework. It's from a paper by Ed Buffington. And it's a standard real model, a small open economy, two-sector model. It's a general equilibrium model with traded and non-traded goods, with optimizing households and non-optimizing or rationed households. So some of the households save and do so in an intertemporally efficient way, subject to the prices they face, and there are rationed households that are more hand-to-mouth type of consumers. Standard macroeconomic deceit to get some structure into these models. We have a government that's not an optimizing government. It has a tax system. It supplies public infrastructure, which is a pure public good. It complements the private factors of production. It's inefficient in its construction, so a dollar spent on public investment doesn't give you a dollar of public capital because of various unmodeled inefficiencies. And we have the possibility of concessional and non-concessional financing. I'm not going to talk much about the financing side. Think of the financing, borrowing for investment as just changing the profile of the required tax obligation of the country. That you borrow now, you can keep taxes low now, but you obviously need to raise taxes to finance the higher level of debt service that was consequent to incurring debt for investment. Okay, so two tax instruments. One is a distortionary tax on output. Think about this as a metaphor that all the distortions in the economy, and the other is a non-distortionary consumption tax. So it's effectively a lump sum tax because there's no labour supply margin in particular. We calibrate this model, we introduce recurrent cost obligations, and we allow for partial cost recovery. And this is the picture that we're going to be working with. That we've got these two taxes, consumption tax, which is non-distortionary, at least, as I say, across steady states. I can explain that later. And an output tax that essentially the distortion rises in the square of the tax rate. It's a standard kind of approximation from public finance. It's all about triangles. And so we get this sharply increasingly distortionary output tax. Please remember this is a metaphor for the tax system as a whole. We're not saying that the economies actually have a straight output tax. So what we're going to do is look at this economy where it's a 50% sustained increase in public investment. You may think that sounds very large, but what we're talking about is from about 6% to 9% of GDP per annum. And the 6% is kind of towards the lower end in kind of Uganda, Tanzania. 9% is closer to kind of a Kenyan level. And what we're going to look at, and what I'll talk about here, is what happens when we think about fiscal reform. So there are two types of fiscal reform that could go on. One is an institutional budgetary sort of reform in which government somehow gets its act together and manages to ring-fence or protect operations and maintenance expenditure, therefore sustaining the flow of public service, of services that come from the public capital, and maintaining that public capital on an efficient depreciation trajectory. Deficiency on either account reduces the value of that public investment to private factors of action. Then we can look at tax reforms where we explore essentially a revenue neutral reform of the tax system, replacing the output tax with the consumption tax. This is a very dramatic, radical tax reform that moves the economy from a quite highly distortionary tax to a non-distortionary tax. But it's the effects are not necessarily linear, but probably monotonic between the two. Okay, so just about 5 minutes. Just a couple of numbers to set the scene. What we do is we start off with a baseline case where we've got full efficiency in maintenance and operations. That initially sets the index values for real wages, GDP, capital, etc. at 100, and this costs the government about just under 3% of recurrent costs to maintain this capital stock at full efficiency. Common technology across all these experiments and a common labour supply. Starting from this setup with a consumption tax, a non-distortionary tax, and we have a 20% reduction in the underlying efficiency of public capital because of maintenance and operations, we have what appears to be a kind of a false economy. We spend much less on O&M, but at the cost of a much smaller economy. This is an initial steady state. This is before we look at growth. Likewise, having an output tax, a distortionary tax in place, we just have a hell of a lot less capital in this economy because of the tax distortions, lower real wages, and a lower initial GDP, and that's exacerbated if we have deficient. So let's just have a look at, I'm going to look at 2.5 cases. The first is just a baseline. So we've got this big increase, permanent increase in public capital, public investment, and it's going to raise the capital stock by 50% between the steady states. And in this nice undistorted fashion, in the first column, the key things are we get a crowding in of private capital from the infrastructure investment of about 2, and we get corresponding growth in real wages, consumption, and output. And an increase in the O&M costs and an increase in the tax rate. This is entirely tax financed, but this tax rate rises by about 3 percentage points to sustain a higher level of public investment. Okay? So 50% increase in the investment rate, and we bump up the tax rate by about 3 percentage points on the consumption tax base. I'm going to go to this one and then I'll come back if I've got time. With an output tax rate, the growth rate from the same investment surge is significantly lower. It's 2 percentage points lower. Real wage growth, likewise, much lower, and a lower rate of consumption growth. Again, the tax rate must increase. In both cases, if we have a deficient O&M, we get a lower tax rate. There's a saving here. We get what looks like broadly similar rates of growth, but these are from a lower base to start with. Recall that with deficient operations and maintenance, it's on a much lower base. So what we're getting out of this is, that's my 5-minute warning, what we get out of this is a much lower level of per capita income and slower growth rates with the distortion of the system. I beg your pardon? Yes. The current account. The a rough summary statistic for the current account in these tables is the real exchange, the equilibrium group of the real exchange rate. It's not terribly different in all forms, but you'll see in the next slide it does matter a lot. Here it's the investment surge that dominates the current account, but we switch that off, that's meant to change. Point 2, and then I'll conclude on point 3. Point 2 is the case that we're particularly worried about. You get this enthusiasm from the markets for this surge of public investment. And what happens if the recurrent costs don't increase in line with the capital investment? So the basic idea here is that we get public investment rising by 50%, that's 3% of GDP. But for the marginal increase, the operations and maintenance rises by only about 50% of that. And that lowers the average coverage. What we get here is a very strongly false economy. So this deficient O&M essentially saves a little bit of the O&M costs as a share of GDP, at least. But the problem is this severe deterioration in the effective public capital stock that's coming through the deficiency in O&M, with the result that in the extreme case, where both maintenance is deficient and operations are deficient, so capital stock is depreciating quicker and generating a lower flow of services, what we get is essentially a crowding out of private capital, a very stagnant rate of growth compared to 13% down to 2%, and a contraction in real consumption. Essentially, the failure to maintain the capital stock is immiserizing in this case. The numbers we're using here are not particularly outrageous, as we said. The final point, and this will be my concluding statement, is in this environment, the returns to various forms of fiscal reform, here with no public investment at all, are really very substantial in the model economy. The big challenge is to translate these into the empirics of actual economies. So simply moving improvements in the O&M with nothing else happening, so no investment at all, is going to give you a sort of 15% increase in steady state GDP. Likewise, 40% increase in the effective capital stock with no investment. This is just the rehabilitation through improved operations and maintenance, and what we're getting is a really very significant crowding in of private investment. It's this private investment crowding in that's driving the growth. The consequence is the output tax rate falls in this economy. That from the initial steady state where it was 17%, it falls down to 15%. Combine that with the tax reform, and you're absolutely in the clover here. These are huge numbers. They're unrealistically large because the tax reform is super efficient and radical, but it gives a sense of the strength of some of these things. So let me just finish with a couple of observations. So what we're doing, just to recap, we're exploring this framework in a step of simply adding two basic staples of public finance theory: that taxation inflicts dead weight loss, public investment entails ongoing budgetary costs of O&M. These are so basic that you have to read the fund's papers a couple of times to convince yourself that they're not actually including these in their analysis, and they're not. The point is the implications are absolutely material, very large in the model economy, and suggest that we need to take these aspects of public investment and growth very seriously, but to go further, like the previous presentation said, we need a lot more research. We need better calibration, better data on these issues. Let me stop at that point. Sorry for rushing the last details.
Help open the discussion this afternoon on this paper. look at this. My first point that I want to make is what are the difficulties of public infrastructure investment, some of which are very, very clearly put forward in this presentation. Well, the first difficulty is that it's public. So you have collective nature in some sense, in some instances, a public good. So it's highly dependent on governance and institutions. There's some work on how even local governance affects the maintenance costs and the maintenance of capital. But also country institutions, of course, if you think that there may be incentives to provide certain type of public capital, not others, and in certain way, okay? Namely, for instance, a preference for large projects up front, and not really a lot of focus on the maintenance, operations and maintenance. So deciding what to do and who pays is a large part of the decision and connected with the public nature. And what was discussed in this paper related to this was mostly how far can you go in collecting user fees, for instance. So that was the main element, but everywhere as a public good there's this issue. People ideally would pay differently for the same good, and sometimes in terms of political economy that's not easy to do. The second difficulty with public infrastructure investment is that's an investment. So there's a time profile of for instance, the financial and other benefits, the financial costs and benefits. So you disburse now, the benefits will come later. This is more complicated than other collective endeavors where you don't have this time lag. You have voluminous finance today and difficulties charging tomorrow, probably a lot of small charges that can add up to the full cost of maintenance. So you have the question of build and then maintain or not, and how to maintain. And the final difficulty is the fact that it's infrastructure. So there are benefits to the private sector. That's the idea of the investment, of this type of investment. There may be private and social benefits. And several research papers have shown that because it's infrastructure, because the amounts are large, this may be very vulnerable to corruption. So for instance, it may be harder, even though we can discuss this, it may be harder to take a fee, it may be harder to take a fee on funds that are meant to provide books for small kids, where you have a lot of small kids checking with their parents if they have the books, relative to have these large infrastructure projects where 10, 15, 20%, it's probably very easy to put under the mattress. Actually, infrastructure and defense projects in general. Okay, so this is the difficulty. I remember working on a project with Philippe Larraín and Jeffrey Sachs in Central America. And for those that don't know Central America, it's a very diverse group of countries, 5 or 6 countries, but very diverse. You go from Costa Rica, which has democratic institutions, very deeply ingrained, to countries like Guatemala and El Salvador that were dictatorships, hardcore dictatorships for a long time. What struck us, the group that went there to do some of the work, is that in Costa Rica the roads were visibly and terribly in much poorer condition than the roads in Guatemala, who was a poorer country and a dictatorship. So the roads in Costa Rica went in the same road. You could go from 5 different types of mattress, if you want, road mattress, from pure mud, to perfect asphalt, and this was the same road. It depended on the municipality you were crossing. So this was a democracy, very vibrant democracy, and these were the roads. In Guatemala, dictatorship, the roads were impeccable, most of the roads. So a friend of mine went on to write a paper on why dictatorships have better infrastructure. There's some evidence of that, but tells you that maybe the economics of the thing is not really the most relevant, but political economy aspects are really very important. So given this, I want to make couple of questions to Adam before I open the discussion. The first is the idea of an infrastructure gap. You said it was a large infrastructure gap that you mentioned 40 to 100 billion dollars. Relative to GDP, to African GDP, I wonder if this is really large. I mean, $100 billion is about half of Portuguese GDP, and this is capital. This is something you build, and then if you maintain it appropriately, it lasts for 30, 40 years. So I wonder if there's a large infrastructure gap, or there's a terribly large infrastructure maintenance gap, which means that infrastructure spending in the past was basically way away because of different incentives, local and also the donors, the builders, which sometimes have very perverse incentives and actually get their returns, very high returns, and they are associated with the interest groups in developed countries that provide everything, including the bad roads. This is one issue. The other issue, you mentioned that there was a blend financing, and there was a lot of hope related to this mix of domestic, external, concessional, non-concessional. You didn't go very much into that in the presentation, but I was wondering if you can tell us why the mix of finances, and maybe who finances, cannot address some of the problems that you mentioned, like the distortionary taxation coupled with low appropriability and recurrent costs. So if you could go more into that, I'd appreciate it.
First, yes, how large is large on the infrastructure gap is a good point. I think one of the things that struck me, just looking at these numbers, is how little precision there is in these estimates. So the number from the Commission for Africa, the Blair Commission from 2005, doesn't appear to be grounded in anything in particular, other than the kind of thoughts and musings of the wise men and women. And I think it was wise men only in that commission. The Africa Country Africa Infrastructure Country Diagnostic from the World Bank is a huge undertaking. There's an awful lot of background research on this. And their headlines were about $90 to $100 billion. They certainly describe it as large and critical and in a very qualitative sense. It is only a measure of deficiency across a relatively small slice of the infrastructure. So it's actually power and transport. So they're not looking at any of the MDG type of infrastructure that I mentioned as well. So scaling it back onto GDP, and it is for sub-Saharan Africa, and excludes South Africa. I think you can make the case that it's large in some rather casual way of describing it. In terms of the importance of the financing mix, well, I think there are a couple of issues. One is recognizing the fact that financing is a timing issue. It's not. We're not talking about free resources. That if you borrow today to finance the capital formation, you've got to service that debt essentially in perpetuity unless you decide to invest in the future in buying down the debt. So what it tends to do, rather naturally, is it just smooths the tax profile given any public investment decisions. So if it calls for public investment, if you tax finance it, then you're facing a steeply rising tax schedule, and there you're back into standard macro theory of tax smoothing. So you would make the case for debt financing in those circumstances to avoid the excess distortion of rapidly adjusting your tax rate, even though in a sort of standard barrel model, your tax rate's going to rise in the new steady state. What the debt does is it allows you to take a smooth tax profile and let you finance it at the front end. So it's an inter-temporal welfare question, and it probably becomes very important if in association with with debt financing, you have in some sense a set of reforms underway that during the period that you're debt financing capital formation, you're also putting in place the institutional and other reforms that reduce the marginal distortion of the tax rate. So you could see a sort of macro package that is a win-win in terms of smoothing the tax profile, but also lowering the distortion as you go. What matters, of course, is you've got it depends how you characterize capital account in this model. So the choice between domestic and external financing is going to depend a lot on there are two or three general equilibrium characteristics. One is the amount of domestic crowding out that choice gives you, and that's going to depend on the extent to which domestic interest rates are tied to world interest rates. It's a capital account story. The second issue is the extent to which you want to characterize the country risk premium in this model. So if you're pessimistic about the country risk premium, so that the cost of external concessional financing, non-concessional financing is pretty elastic with respect to the premium, then you would be rather concerned about kind of sovereign bond type of external non-concessional financing. What you can do is just show the welfare gains to what Paul was talking about, this sort of IBRD type of financing and the blending of concessional or semi-concessional external finance with non-concessional domestic and external. But this is a general equilibrium model, so in a sense you can play around with it as much as you want. My final point here is I appreciate all those comments that you made about all the challenges of characterizing the nature of public goods, the political economy constraints, the Costa Rica story. For the macroeconomist or macro modeler, the big challenge is, can we parameterize this in some very parsimonious fashion, and can we say something sensible about the sensitivity of macrodynamics to that parameterization? And I think it's the second part of that's important in this exercise. How important are these rather nuanced aspects of the process to the overall macro balance?
Okay, I think we'll open now the floor. So we have you want to speak? You want to speak? So let's have
I am asking, fine, but just I wanted to be clear about what my preference is.
So let's have one question at least, maybe 1.5.
I'm going to ask a very long question. No, it's just given that you add to the debt stability analysis, the classic debt stability analysis, classic, it's brand new basically, two dimensions which are going to be important for everyone basically, and the experiments you perform are also important basically for everyone. When I say everyone, all IMF countries. So have you tried, for instance, to think about calibrating the gains to developed economies so that maybe you have a range of a quantitative view of what could be those gains, and maybe and then map it back to African countries where it's going to be much more difficult to find proxies and things like that.
There's a trade-off here, that in a sense the empirical challenge is arguably going to be more straightforward in middle-income or developed economies, but the model that we have developed is very much structured on a small open economy. Maybe we could, yes. So there is an overlap. There are plenty of small open economy, sort of middle income and OECD small open economies. there are a couple of things you want to do. One is be a little bit more sympathetic to the way in which you characterize the distortions in the tax system, where you've got, it's a little bit more subtle than what we have here, but we're working on that at the moment. The other thing is, yeah, it's parameterization. It's things like characterization of capital accounts, the extent to which domestic and world interest rates co-move. So that's a kind of elasticity question about the capital account. What we are doing at the moment, there are two lines of attack. One, this version of the paper is targeted at the IMF. It's an IMF working paper. It's about encouraging them in their more general work to build these things in. We're in the midst of a very detailed piece of work on Uganda. So looking at actual public investment programs and a much more realistic calibration of the behavioural parameters and in particular the tax structure of Uganda. So hopefully in a couple of months' time we'll have a much more grounded version of the model that gives you a better sense of the macro dynamics, and then depending on it's obviously a disputed area how we characterise the welfare effects, what sort of social welfare function we want to write down in this model. So that's always going to be
I think we are not one little small suggestion. Yes, there have been computations of the return of operations and maintenance. The return to maintenance of public projects in place already, relative to the general return of public. And this, the first one, is orders of magnitude larger, especially in developing countries. That is, fixing a road has returns of sometimes 150%, which is completely different ballpark, which means that there's two margins and one seems to be really.
we capture that a little bit in our kind of O&M recovery experiments. But I take your point that that's probably where the big mountain buck is. It's not the new projects, it's the rehabilitation of at least of that part of the capital stock that is still can be rehabilitated. There's a cut-off point somewhere where it's better just to again, but I take it.
So I'm very pleased to introduce José, who will make the keynote closing speech. George, the floor is yours.